Hey guys, tonight we're sneaking into the captain's cabin of the Queen Anne's Revenge on the one strange, quiet night before its captain turned an entire city into a hostage. We're talking about a man who reportedly tucked slow-burning matches under the brim of his hat so his own face looked like it was on fire, a locked chest of medicine worth somewhere around £300 or £400 sterling that a whole port had to hand over, just to get its own citizens back alive, and one long night in May of 1718 when almost nobody aboard that ship, least of all the man in the largest cabin, slept easy. Welcome to the deck of a 40-gun flagship, anchored in the dark just off the Charleston bar, waiting for morning to come and bring the worst week of the city's year with it. Go ahead and dim the lights now, maybe let a fan hum low in the background, something close enough to the creak of old rigging and the slap of water on a hull that your mind can borrow it for the next little while. You're warm right now, you're still. That won't be quite as true for the man whose cabin we're about to sit in tonight, and it was considerably less true for almost everyone crammed into the deck below him. So get comfortable, settle in, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice is the smell. Tar, brine, wet rope, and under all of it, something sourer. Bilge water sloshing in the belly of the ship, thick with whatever has been rotting down there since the last time anyone bothered to pump it out. You're lying in a hammock slung low between two beams, and the ship rocks in that slow, patient way a vessel rocks when it's riding at anchor rather than fighting. Open water. For a moment that rocking almost feels peaceful. It shouldn't. You are aboard this Queen Anne's Revenge, flagship of the pirate Edward Teach, the man the broadsheets and the frightened merchants of two colonies have already started calling Blackbeard, and tonight, the 21st of May, 1718, is the last ordinary night this ship will know for a while. Somewhere above you, feet cross the deck in the unhurried rhythm of a night watch. Somewhere below you, other men sleep, or pretend to. Tomorrow, this ship and 3 others like it are going to seal off the mouth of Charleston harbour and hold it hostage. Tonight, nobody has said that word out loud yet, but the guns have already been checked twice. You didn't choose to be here, not exactly. 3 berths down, a man named Josiah Cobb is doing the same thing you are, lying awake, listening to the ship breathe. Cobb was a ship's carpenter aboard a small trading sloop out of Bermuda until 6 weeks ago, when Teach's flotilla ran her down off the Carolina coast and decided his particular skills were worth keeping. He wasn't asked so much as informed. That's the part popular memory tends to blur when it pictures pirate crews as bands of cheerful volunteers. A meaningful share of any Golden Age crew, this one included, was made up of men taken directly off captured vessels, because the ship needed a specific trade, a carpenter, a surgeon, a navigator, and volunteers with those exact skills weren't standing by. Cobb keeps a stub of chalk in his coat pocket and marks a small line on the inside of a timber near his hammock each morning. 41 lines, as of tonight. He hasn't told anyone what he's counting toward. He isn't entirely sure himself. By the changing of the first watch, past 9 at night, the ship has gone through its version of settling down, which on a vessel about to blockade a major port is not the same as calm. Men sharpen boarding axes by lantern light. Someone below decks is quietly retuning a fiddle that's gone flat in the humidity. The Queen Anne's Revenge. Herself carries somewhere in the neighbourhood of 40 guns by this point in her career, an extraordinary number for a pirate vessel, more cannon than most small naval warships of the era bothered to carry, because she wasn't built as a pirate ship at all. She started her life as a French slave ship, and we'll get to exactly how a slaver became the most feared flag on the American seaboard shortly. For tonight, what matters is that she is, by a wide margin, the largest and most heavily armed pirate vessel, operating anywhere along the eastern coast of the Americas, and everyone aboard her knows it. It's the nautical equivalent of showing up to a neighbourhood argument with a tank. Nobody expects a fair fight. That's rather the point. Up a short ladder and aft, past a marine sentry who barely glances at you, sits the captain's cabin, the room this whole night orbits around, whether the crew realises it or not. It is, by the standards of the rest of the ship, almost civilized. There's a proper desk bolted to the floor covered in charts of the Carolina coastline weighted down at the corners, with a brass compass and, oddly, a half-empty bottle of Madeira. A logbook taken from a captured vessel sits open. its previous owner's careful merchant handwriting replaced partway through by a rougher hand. Weapons hang within easy reach of the bunk, a brace of pistols, a cutlass, nothing decorative about any of it. Here's the thing about Edward Teach that tends to get lost under 300 years of legend. The beard, the lit matches tucked under his hatband to wreathe his face in smoke during a boarding. The sheer theatre of the man. All of that, according to the well-known but heavily dramatised account published a few years after his death, was deliberate costume. Tonight, with no boarding to stage, he's simply a man at a desk doing arithmetic with other people's lives, deciding exactly how much of Charleston's fear he's going to need to spend to get what he wants. What he wants, as it happens, is medicine. Specifically, a chest of it, bandages, purgatives, and, this being an era when venereal disease and tropical fever cut through a crew faster than any naval broadside, likely mercury compounds used to treat the former. A flotilla numbering somewhere close to 300 or 400 men across 4 vessels does not stay healthy by luck alone, and pirate crews, cut off from any port willing to sell to them openly, had no reliable way to restock a medicine chest through ordinary trade. So tomorrow, Teach is going to do something almost no other pirate captain of the era bothered to try. Instead of simply robbing ships for coin and rum, he's going to blockade an entire provincial capital and hold its passengers hostage until the city government hands over medical supplies. It is, in its own grim way, a remarkably specific ask. Picture a highway robber who skips the cash entirely and demands you empty your medicine cabinet instead. That's essentially what's about to happen to Charleston, South Carolina, and by morning, nobody in that city is going to find it the least bit funny. By the second bell of the middle watch, somewhere around 1 in the morning, most of the ship has finally gone quiet. Though quiet aboard a pirate flagship on the eve of a blockade is a relative term. Josiah Cobb, still awake in his hammock, listens to the low murmur of 2 men gambling by lantern light nearby. Dice, most likely, since a full deck of cards tends not to survive long at sea, and to the creak of the anchor cable holding 4 ships steady in the dark water off the bar. He thinks, he'll say later, about the small trading town he grew up near, close enough to Charleston's own harbour that he half expects someone tomorrow to recognise his face across the water and shout his name to the wrong people. There is a particular quiet dread that belongs only to forced men in moments like this one. Not the dread of the pirates around them, who at least chose this life and stand to profit from tomorrow's demand, but the dread of a man who knows that if this ship is caught, the law will not much care that he never signed the articles willingly. Admiralty courts of the period were not known for passing the difference between a volunteer and a conscript with much sympathy. Cobb turns over, chalk stub still in his pocket, and does not sleep. Not every man aboard is dreading the morning, though. On the gun deck, a knot of crew who did sign the ship's articles willingly, men who voted for this life and stand to take an equalish share of whatever the blockade produces, are doing what off-duty sailors have always done with a nervous night. They're making it louder than it needs to be. A fiddle finally gets tuned properly. Someone produces a battered concertina taken off a captured sloop weeks earlier. There's rum, watered down more than any of them would like to admit, poured into tin cups that once belonged to a Bermuda merchant. And here, in the middle of all that noise, is where the part of pirate life that popular imagination tends to skip over actually shows itself: the articles. Every man aboard a properly organised pirate vessel of this period, and even a captain as theatrical as Teach, ran a ship with formal, voted-on rules, even if his own written articles haven't survived the way some of his contemporaries have, sailed under a document the crew themselves had a hand in approving, roughly equal shares of any prize, a vote for who commanded the ship and the power to depose a captain who mishandled it, and, strikingly for the era, a compensation scale for injury. Other Golden Age pirate articles on record promised a man who lost a leg or an arm in a fight a fixed payout. Commonly cited figures run somewhere around 600 to 800 pieces of 8 for a lost limb, paid out of the common stock before anyone else took their share. A merchant sailor or a Royal Navy hand injured in the King's service could expect no such guarantee. It's an uncomfortable thing to sit with. The same ship about to terrorise a city tomorrow ran, internally, on rules considerably fairer to its own crew than most legitimate maritime employment of the era offered anyone. Josiah Cobb doesn't join the gambling. He's not a signed man, and there's an invisible but very real line between the two categories that nobody enforces with violence so much as with distance. The volunteers drink together, and the forced men keep to the edges. But Israel Hands, the ship's master and one of Teach's most trusted officers, passes through the gun deck on a round of inspection sometime near 2 a.m. and stops, briefly, beside Cobb's hammock. Hands is a real documented figure aboard this ship, not a legend built up decades later, but a man whose name appears in the historical record of this crew, and whatever else history remembers him for. Tonight he simply tells Cobb, not unkindly, to get some sleep if he can, because tomorrow the carpenter's tools are going to matter more than they have in weeks. It's not warmth exactly, but it's not nothing either, and Cobb will remember the small courtesy of it long after he's forgotten most of what happens on this ship. There's a flag folded in a chest near the quarterdeck that hasn't been run up the mast yet, and won't be until first light. You've seen it before, but it's worth pausing on, because it isn't the plain skull and crossbones that modern imagination reaches for automatically. Teach's personal flag, as described by witnesses and later writers of the period, shows a horned skeleton, the figure of death itself, holding an hourglass in one hand and in the other a spear pointed directly at a bleeding heart, the whole thing toasting a goblet as if death were raising a drink to your health before killing you. It's a genuinely unsettling piece of design work for the early 18th century, closer to a memento mori than a simple warning, and that's rather the point. A pirate flag wasn't advertising. It was a message with a very specific legal function. Run up the black flag, and a targeted ship that surrendered without a fight could reasonably expect to be robbed and released. Ignore it, force a fight, and the rules change considerably. Some pirate captains of the era flew a plain black flag for the first warning, and switched to red, no quarter given, surrender no longer an option if a ship refused to yield. Whether Teach followed that exact colour code with strict consistency is disputed among historians, but the underlying logic wasn't. Fear, deployed correctly, meant fewer cannonballs had to actually be fired, which meant less damage to whatever cargo was about to become his. Sailors of every allegiance in this period carried superstitions the way modern people carry phone habits, reflexive, half-believed, impossible to shake even when you'd insist under questioning that you don't really buy into any of it. Whistling on deck was thought to summon a storm, so nobody does it tonight, not even to break the tension. A man due to go over the side in a small boat before dawn touches the iron ring of a gun carriage first, for luck, the same gesture his father likely made on a merchant vessel decades earlier. None of it is unique to pirates. Nearly every sailing culture of the age shared some version of these small rituals, because a wooden ship a few hundred miles from the nearest doctor or dry land turns everyone, eventually, into someone willing to hedge their bets against forces they can't control. Tonight, with a blockade of a major colonial port hours away, the superstitions feel a little less like habit and a little more like genuine prayer, even from men who'd never used that word for it. There's one more sound worth noticing before the ship truly wakes, and it belongs to the ship's boys, the youngest crew aboard, some barely into their teens, whose job tonight has nothing to do with cannon or cutlass at all. They move quietly between hammocks with a bucket of tallow and a coil of slow match, checking and rechecking the lengths of cord that will, come morning, be tucked under Teach's hatband to produce the smoke that terrifies grown merchant captains half to death. It's an oddly domestic image if you sit with it for a moment. Children, essentially, carefully preparing the props for the day's theatre, the way a stagehand might check a costume before a performance neither of them fully controls the ending of. One of them, a boy of perhaps 13 who signed on with an older brother 2 voyages back, pauses near where you're lying and asks, in a whisper pitched low enough not to carry, whether you think tomorrow will be bad. You don't have a good answer for him. Nobody aboard this ship does. Not really. And that includes the man whose face that slow match is about to wreathe in smoke. What almost nobody below decks knows yet, and this is the kind of detail that would have changed the mood considerably if word of it had spread before dawn, is that Teach has already decided, in the privacy of his cabin, roughly how far he's willing to let tomorrow's demand escalate if Charleston balks. That decision doesn't get shared with the crew. It doesn't need to be. The plan works precisely because everyone aboard, forced and willing alike, radiates a kind of genuine, unrehearsed tension that no amount of coach bravado could fake as convincingly, and a city watching 4 ships take up position across its harbour mouth doesn't need to know the captain's exact private calculations to be thoroughly, effectively terrified by the sight of them. What happens below decks in the hours after the blockade actually begins is a different matter entirely, and we'll get to it soon enough. For now, the ship simply waits, the way ships full of frightened, hopeful, resentful and resigned men have always waited for a dawn none of them can do anything to slow down. By 4 a.m, the sky out past the harbour bar has only just begun to grey at its edges, and the ship starts to wake up around you whether it slept or not. Boots on deck planking. The particular double thud of a gun carriage being run out and checked one final time. Somewhere forward, the anchor watch calls a routine report that means nothing to you and everything to the men steering this operation. 4 vessels, the Queen Anne's Revenge. Among them, alongside smaller sloops that will do the actual work of stopping and boarding incoming ships, are about to form a loose, deliberate line across the only channel in and out of one of the wealthiest ports in British North America. What happens after sunrise isn't a raid in the usual pirate sense of chasing down a single ship and taking its cargo. It's closer to a siege, conducted entirely at sea, against a city that has no navy of its own close enough to help it. Josiah Cobb finally does drift into something like sleep in the last hour before dawn, chalk stub still in his coat pocket, 41 lines behind him, and no idea yet how many more there are going to be. Somewhere above him, in the cabin with the charts and the Madeira, Edward Teach is already awake, and has been for some time. The ship that's about to make all of this possible didn't start out as anything close to a warship, and to understand exactly what's about to happen at Charleston, it helps to understand what she actually was before Teach ever set foot on her deck. Late November 1717, somewhere in the waters near the Grenadine Islands, a French merchant vessel called La Concorde is 11 weeks out from Nantes, and her crew are in no condition for a fight. Roughly 75 men signed on for this voyage, and dysentery has already been through the ship like a scythe through wheat. By most reconstructions of the log, a third or more of the crew are too sick to stand a watch, let alone load a cannon. Below deck, in conditions almost too brutal to narrate gently, are somewhere in the range of 400 to 500 enslaved African men, women and children, taken from the Bight of Benin and bound for the French Caribbean, where they were to be sold into a system designed to work human beings to death for profit. And bearing down on this weakened, overloaded ship are 2 pirate vessels flying colours that mean exactly what everyone aboard La Concorde is afraid they mean. There is no real fight. There barely could have been. Within a short engagement, the French ship strikes her colours and surrenders, and the man who steps aboard to claim her, a former privateer turned pirate named Edward Teach, sailing at this point under the more experienced captain Benjamin Hornigold, has just acquired, almost by accident, the ship that is going to make him the most feared name on the eastern seaboard of North America. This is the story of the Queen Anne's Revenge, the ship that turned a fairly ordinary pirate captain into a legend, and the uncomfortable, often glossed over truth about where she came from before that happened. La Concorde was not built for war. She was built for the transatlantic slave trade, a purpose-fitted vessel of roughly 200 tons, and in the 11 weeks before Teach's crew ran her down, she had already completed the horror that every ship in that trade was designed to complete. The Middle Passage, the forced crossing that killed an estimated 1 in 7 of the people held below her decks before they ever reached land. Here's the thing, modern retellings of the Queen Anne's Revenge story tend to sand down or skip entirely. When Teach took the ship, several hundred enslaved people were still aboard her, because she hadn't yet reached the port where they were to be sold. What happened to them afterward is not fully settled by the surviving record, and it should not be smoothed into a tidy narrative in either direction. Contemporary depositions and later reconstructions suggest that most of the enslaved captives were transferred, along with La Concordion's original French crew, onto a smaller vessel that Teach's men gave up in the exchange, effectively swapping ships, while a portion, estimates vary and the exact number is disputed, remained with the pirates, some of them reportedly integrated into the crew going forward rather than sold. It is not a redemption story. It does not erase the horror of the Middle Passage those people had already survived, nor guarantee what came after was meaningfully better. But it is one more example of how much messier and less cinematic the real history sits than the legend that grew up around this ship over the following 3 centuries. With the smaller vessel handed off and La Concorde now firmly in pirate hands, Teach and Hornigold set about turning a slave ship into something considerably more dangerous. She was rechristened Queen Anne's Revenge, a name whose politics are worth sitting with for a moment. Queen Anne herself had died 5 years earlier, in 1714, and the name almost certainly nodded to lingering resentment among former privateers like Teach over the peace that ended the War of the Spanish Succession, a peace that put thousands of formerly government-employed sailors out of work practically overnight and pushed no small number of them toward piracy simply because it was the only trade they still had the skills for. Refitted and upgunned, she eventually carried somewhere in the neighbourhood of 40 cannon, an armament that would not have looked out of place on a small naval frigate of the period, and one that dwarfed almost every other pirate vessel then sailing the Americas. Picture upgrading from a getaway car to an armoured truck, except the truck also has enough firepower to argue with a small navy and occasionally win. Where exactly all 40 of those cannon originally came from is itself a small puzzle worth mentioning, since a captured French slave ship would not ordinarily have carried anywhere near that many guns as built. The bulk of the additional armament was almost certainly accumulated the same way most of the flotilla's other resources were, stripped from captured prizes over the following months, a cannon or two taken here, a swivel gun there, gradually converting what had started as a modestly armed merchant vessel into something closer to a small, improvised warship built entirely out of other people's losses. It's a fitting origin story for the single most feared piece of hardware on the eastern seaboard, not purpose-built for war at any single shipyard, but assembled piecemeal, prize by stolen prize, into something considerably more dangerous than the sum of its scattered parts. Not long after the Concord capture, the partnership that made it possible came apart. Benjamin Hornigold, the more senior and more experienced captain, had been operating out of Nassau in the Bahamas for years, as part of what later became known, somewhat romantically, as the Flying Gang, a loose confederation of pirate captains who treated the port as a shared base of operations, more or less beyond the reach of any government. But by early 1718, word was spreading through Nassau that the Crown intended to send an official governor with orders and the naval muscle to shut the pirate haven down for good, and offer a pardon to any pirate willing to quit before he arrived. Hornigold, notably, was among the pirates who eventually accepted exactly that kind of pardon and walked away from the trade for good, an oddly quiet ending for a man who'd helped build one of the most successful pirate operations of the era. Teach did not follow him. Whether the split was philosophical, practical, or simply a matter of two strong-willed captains no longer needing to share command of a flotilla that size, the surviving record doesn't settle definitively. What it does show is that from this point forward, the Queen Anne's Revenge and the reputation attached to her belonged to Edward Teach alone, and he wasted no time using both. Over the following months, the flotilla grew rather than shrank, which is itself a small piece of evidence for how much Teach's reputation was already doing the work for him before Charleston ever entered the picture. A wealthy Barbadian landowner named Stede Bonnet, who we'll spend considerably more time with later tonight, brought his own sloop, the Revenge, into loose partnership with Teach in the autumn of 1717. A smaller sloop called the Adventure, under a master named David Heriot, joined the group as well. By the spring of 1718, conservative estimates put the combined crews of Teach's flotilla somewhere between 300 and 400 men across 4 vessels, a floating small town's worth of people, all of them dependent, one way or another, on the reputation of one ship and the man who commanded her. That's not a small operation by the standards of Golden Age piracy. Most pirate captains of the era were lucky to command a single sloop with a crew in the dozens. Teach was, functionally, running a small squadron, and squadrons need supplies, repairs, and, as you already know by now, medicine, in quantities that ordinary piracy on merchant shipping simply didn't reliably provide. Careening a ship this size was its own small ordeal worth pausing on, because it happened regularly and it wasn't optional. Wooden hulls in warm Atlantic and Caribbean water accumulate marine growth and shipworm at a genuinely alarming rate. A hull left unmaintained for months could lose a meaningful percentage of its speed to barnacle drag alone, which for a ship whose entire strategy depended on catching prizes before they could flee was close to an existential problem. Careening meant running the ship into shallow water, deliberately heeling her over onto one side at low tide, scraping the exposed hull clean and patching any damage, all while the vessel sat completely defenceless, and half the crew worked waist-deep in mud and tidal muck. It was filthy, exhausting, unglamorous labour, the maritime equivalent of an oil change that takes 2 full days and leaves everyone covered in tar. The Queen Anne's Revenge had been careened more than once by the spring of 1718, each time a brief window when the most feared ship on the coast was, for a day or two essentially helpless, a detail the legend rarely mentions because helplessness doesn't fit the story nearly as well as the 40 guns do. By April of 1718, the flotilla was operating openly along the American coast, and Teach's name, or rather, the name Blackbeard, which had by then almost entirely replaced whatever he'd been called before he took up piracy, was doing genuine strategic work. Merchant captains who saw the black flag and recognised the ship beneath it increasingly chose to strike their colours and surrender without a fight, correctly calculating that resistance against 40 guns and several hundred men was less a battle than a formality on the way to a worse outcome. Fear, deployed consistently enough, becomes its own weapon system, and by the time the flotilla turned its attention toward Charleston in May, that weapon had been sharpened for the better part of a year. The city on the other end of that reputation had no real way of knowing what was coming. It was about to find out. Deep Draught was the ship's other quiet vulnerability, and it's worth flagging now because it becomes important again later tonight. A vessel built to cross the Atlantic loaded with cargo and human beings, then refitted to carry 40 guns on top of that, sat considerably lower in the water than the shallow, nimble sloops that made up the rest of Teach's flotilla. That draft was fine, even useful, in open ocean, where the Queen Anne's Revenge could outgun almost anything she met. It became a serious liability anywhere near a shifting sandbar or an unfamiliar inlet, of which the Carolina coastline had an abundance. A ship that size needed a skilled pilot and accurate current knowledge of the local channels to move safely through shallow coastal water, knowledge that, as we'll see, was not always reliably available to a crew of outsiders operating hundreds of miles from any port that would openly help them chart the bottom. The historical record of who exactly made up Teach's crew by this point is frustratingly thin in places and unusually specific in others. Depositions and court records connected to the flotilla's later encounters do note, in the clipped and often dehumanizing language typical of the period's legal documents, that a number of black crewmen sailed among Teach's men, some very likely among those who chose to remain after La Concorda's capture, rather than being sold onward, others taken up along the way from other captured vessels. Exact numbers and names are not well preserved, and it would be dishonest to claim more precision here than the sources actually support. What can be said honestly is that a pirate crew of this era, for all its violence and coercion, was in practice one of the very few settings in the 18th century Atlantic world where a black sailor could plausibly hold a genuine vote, an equalist share, and a say in who commanded the ship he sailed on, rights denied him almost everywhere else in that same world, under almost every other flag. It's a strange, uncomfortable kind of equality, born entirely out of an outlaw economy that had no interest in fairness for its own sake, and every interest in keeping a fighting crew loyal. But it was there, on paper and in practice, in a way it simply wasn't on a Royal Navy ship or a merchant vessel of the same year. It's worth pausing here on what the Queen Anne's Revenge actually looked like below decks, because the gap between a ship's fearsome reputation and its physical reality tends to be wider than people expect. Cannon of that number and size required an enormous quantity of powder and shot stored securely and kept dry. No small feat on a wooden vessel that leaked constantly and required near daily pumping simply to stay afloat. The gun deck itself, lined with rows of cannon on either side, left barely enough headroom for a man of average height to stand fully upright, and the air down there, thick with the smell of bilge, tar, unwashed bodies and stored gunpowder, was foul enough that officers of the period frequently noted crews falling sick simply from prolonged exposure to it. A ship carrying 300 or 400 souls across her combined flotilla needed fresh water, in quantities that made regular landfall not a luxury but an absolute operational necessity, since a single ship of this size could store only a few weeks' supply before rationing became unavoidable. None of this made it into the legend, of course. Fear doesn't care about ventilation problems, but every man who ever served aboard her, willing or forced alike, lived with these unglamorous realities every single day, in exactly the same cramped, foul-smelling spaces that produced the terror sailing under her flag. There is also the matter of what became of the smaller vessel. Teach's men gave up in the original exchange for La Concorde, a detail that closes the loop on this ship's origin story in a way worth including here rather than leaving hanging. The displaced French crew and the majority of the enslaved captives were put aboard that smaller ship and, according to the fullest reconstructions available, eventually made their way to Martinique, where French colonial authorities took depositions from the ship's officers about the encounter. depositions that form a meaningful part of what historians actually know about the Concordia capture today, since pirate crews themselves left few written records of their own operations. It's a strange thing to consider. Some of the most reliable evidence we have for how the Queen Anne's Revenge came into existence survives, not because Teach or his men wrote it down, but because his victims did, sitting for questioning in a French colonial office, describing a morning that had upended their lives in ways the paperwork could only partially capture. By the time the flotilla turned north and west toward the Carolina coast in the spring of 1718, then the Queen Anne's Revenge was no longer simply a captured slave ship wearing a new name. She was the physical anchor of a small floating outlaw society. 300 or 400 men, a handful of vessels, a set of voted rules, and a growing reputation that had started to do as much damage on its own as her 40 guns ever could. What she was about to be used for next would make Edward Teach's name a byword for maritime terror up and down the entire eastern seaboard, and it started with a decision to stop robbing ships one at a time and instead take an entire city's shipping lane hostage all at once. The morning bell rings, and for a moment, still half asleep in a hammock that smells permanently of salt and tar, you could almost mistake this for an ordinary trading voyage. That illusion lasts exactly as long as it takes to sit up and remember whose ship you're on. It's the spring of 1718, somewhere in the waters off the Carolinas, and you're a working hand aboard Edward Teach's flotilla, not a captain, not an officer, just one of several hundred men keeping 4 vessels moving, fed, armed, and afloat. Nobody explains the routine to you twice. You learn it fast, or you become a problem the crew doesn't have patience for. Breakfast, such as it is, comes first. Ship's biscuit, a rock-hard, twice-baked bread built to survive months at sea without spoiling, soaked briefly in whatever liquid is available to make it chewable, because eating it dry risks a cracked tooth. Here's the part that tends to get left out of the romantic version of pirate life. That biscuit is, more often than anyone wants to think about, faintly moving. Weevils, a small beetle whose larvae infest stored grain and flour, were so reliably present in ship's biscuit across every navy and merchant fleet of the era that sailors developed a grim habit of tapping the biscuit on the table before eating it, just to knock loose whatever had made a home inside. You do the same thing without really thinking about it anymore. It's not disgusting once you've done it 40 times. It's just breakfast. By your second week aboard, you've been assigned a fixed role rather than general labour, and the ship has sorted itself into something closer to a small, floating trade guild than a mob. There's the quartermaster, who on a pirate vessel holds genuine authority independent of the captain. He manages the division of plunder, adjudicates disputes between crewmen, and in many documented pirate crews of this era, actually outranks the captain in matters that don't involve combat, since command in battle and command of daily life aboard were treated as 2 separate jobs, each requiring its own kind of trust. There's the ship's surgeon, desperately valuable and in permanently short supply, valuable enough that pirate crews specifically targeted captured ships known to be carrying one, sometimes offering a signing bonus worth several times an ordinary crewman's share just to convince a captured doctor to stay, rather than be released. And there's a young forced apprentice named Elias Grant, barely 16, taken off a merchant sloop back in February to serve as a powder monkey. The crewman, often the youngest and smallest aboard, tasked with running gunpowder from the ship's magazine up to the guns during a fight, because a smaller body moves faster through cramped passageways and, grim as it is to say, represents a smaller loss if a stray spark finds the wrong barrel at the wrong moment. Elias doesn't say much, at least not at first. He has a habit, you notice, within a few days of working alongside him, of humming the same 3 or 4 notes of some half-remembered hymn under his breath, whenever the work gets tedious, coiling rope, or helping haul supplies below during a careening. It's not much of a detail. It's also the only piece of his old life he seems to have brought aboard with him, and on a ship built almost entirely out of transient, coerced and self-interested relationships. That small private ritual of his sticks with you more than it probably should. The ship's surgeon, when the flotilla has one aboard at all, occupies a strange middle position between valued specialist and reluctant conscript, and the realities of his actual practice bear almost no resemblance to modern medicine. Amputation, when a wound turned gangrenous, was performed with a saw, a tourniquet, and whatever alcohol could be spared to dull the pain, since effective anaesthesia was still well over a century away. Survival rates for a below-the-knee amputation performed under these conditions, by the best estimates historians have pieced together from period medical records, hovered somewhere close to even odds at best, which is precisely why the compensation promised under the ship's articles for a lost limb mattered so much to the men who signed them. A payout was cold comfort, but it was also a recognition, unusual for the era, that a man's body was worth something to the crew even after it had stopped being fully useful to them. You watched the surgeon dress a rope burn on a topman's hand one afternoon with a poultice made partly of tar, and you find yourself hoping, with a specificity you didn't expect, that you never need his more serious skills before this voyage ends. Discipline aboard runs on the articles, and the articles run on a vote which is, again, worth sitting with, because it's genuinely unusual for the period. Every man who signed on willingly had a voice in approving the ship's rules before ever putting to sea, and violations were judged, in principle, by the crew's own standards rather than a captain's unilateral whim. Fighting between crewmen aboard ship was typically forbidden outright, on the practical grounds that a violent grudge in cramped quarters at sea was a fire hazard for the whole crew's morale and safety. Disputes that needed settling were instead pushed ashore, where two aggrieved men might duel with pistols or cutlasses under the supervision of the quartermaster, who called the engagement and, depending on the specific ship's articles, sometimes stopped it the moment first blood was drawn rather than letting it run to a killing. Theft from a fellow crewman, by contrast, was treated with real severity, marooning, in the worst documented cases, on some isolated spit of sand with nothing but a pistol, a little powder, and enough water to make the abandonment feel less like an execution and more like a lottery you were meant to lose slowly. Congratulations, you've just learned the closest thing this ship has to a justice system, and it's simultaneously more democratic and more brutal than almost anything on land. By your third week, the ship needs careening again. You heard about this earlier from the outside. Now you're doing the actual labour of it. The Queen Anne's Revenge is run into shallow water at high tide near an uninhabited stretch of coastline, and as the tide drops, she's deliberately heeled over onto her side using block and tackle, rigged to nearby trees or anchored posts, exposing the barnacle-crusted hull below her waterline. You spend the better part of 2 days waist-deep in warm, silty water, scraping marine growth off with iron scrapers alongside 40 or 50 other men, while a separate crew patches seams with fresh tar and oakum. It is filthy, exhausting, unglamorous work, and for those 2 days the most feared ship on the Atlantic seaboard is completely unable to fight, sail, or flee, which is precisely why careening sites were chosen with as much care as any battle plan, a fact that will matter enormously and rather differently before this story is finished. The watch system itself takes some getting used to, and nobody explains it gently. Crew rotate through 4-hour shifts around the clock, with a shortened pair of 2-hour dog watches worked into the evening rotation specifically so the same men aren't stuck with the miserable middle-of-the-night shift every single day. A small mechanical fairness baked into the ship's routine that most passengers aboard a merchant vessel of the same era would never have thought to ask their own captain for. You come to recognise the rhythm of bells marking each half-hour of a watch, 8 strikes meaning a watch has ended, and within 2 weeks your body starts waking on its own a few minutes before the bell without you consciously willing it to. It's a strange kind of conditioning, and it happens to nearly everyone aboard eventually. Forced men and volunteers alike, because a ship doesn't particularly care what brought you aboard once it's decided to reshape your sleeping habits around its own schedule. Rum, or rather the ration of it, turns out to be one of the more carefully managed resources aboard, which surprises you a little, given the rowdy reputation pirate crews carry in every story you'd ever heard before you were taken. A full daily ration, undiluted, was reserved mostly for celebration nights after a good prize, the kind you'll see shortly. Ordinary days call for a smaller, heavily watered portion, partly because rum was expensive and finite even for a well-supplied flotilla, and partly because a quartermaster running a ship with several hundred armed men aboard had a very practical interest in keeping most of them reasonably sober most of the time. Here's the thing, nobody tells you until you've lived it. A pirate ship that let every man drink freely every day would not survive its first serious storm, let alone a fight. And the men who ran these crews, whatever else you want to say about them, generally understood that discipline and survival were the same problem wearing 2 different hats. Prizes, when they're taken, get assessed with a bluntly practical eye rather than looted indiscriminately. A captured sloop's cargo of Bermuda cedar and turtle shell, brought in during your 4th week aboard, gets appraised by the quartermaster against rough market values the crew has picked up from years of trading, captured goods quietly through sympathetic merchants and small, out-of-the-way ports, willing to buy plunder without asking too many questions. A shadow economy running parallel to and dependent on the legitimate one it was robbing. A hogshead of good sugar might fetch a specific remembered price from a particular contact in a particular port, and that kind of granular, practical knowledge, more than any romantic notion of buried treasure, is what actually kept a flotilla like this one solvent from one month to the next. Buried treasure, incidentally, is almost entirely a later literary invention. There is essentially no reliable historical evidence that real pirates of this era routinely buried their plunder for later recovery, since a share divided and spent quickly was worth considerably more to a man who might not survive the year than a share buried and hoped for. Communication between the flotilla's separate vessels is its own small logistical puzzle you get to watch. Solved in real time during your third week aboard, when the Adventure signals the flagship using a simple, improvised system of flag positions and cannon shot patterns worked out among the captains rather than drawn from any official naval code. Pirate crews, after all, had no access to the standardized signal books that a Royal Navy squadron would have shared, and had to invent their own shorthand from scratch. A single shot means something different depending on which flag flies alongside it, and getting the combination wrong, as one green crewman discovers to considerable embarrassment, can send an entirely unintended message rippling across the flotilla and back before anyone realizes the mistake. It's a small, almost comic illustration of a larger truth about this whole enterprise. A pirate flotilla wasn't handed a rulebook by any authority. Every system aboard, from the articles to the watch rotation to something as basic as how one ship tells another to hold position, had to be built by the crew themselves, tested under pressure, and revised when it failed, which it did, regularly, in ways that could occasionally get people killed, and just as often produced nothing worse than a well-earned round of mockery at the mess table that evening. Within a month of that careening, the flotilla takes a merchant sloop off the Carolina coast, carrying, among other things, a modest quantity of coin and a cask of good rum, considerably better than the watered-down ration you're used to, and for one evening the ship's mood shifts into something almost like a party. There's a fiddle, there's dancing that would look, to modern eyes, less like celebration and more like several dozen exhausted men flailing their limbs in relief that they're all still alive and slightly drunk. Elias Grant, normally quiet, gets talked into a jig by two older crewmen and turns out to be unexpectedly good at it, which earns him the first genuine laughter you've heard aboard this ship since you came aboard. It's a small, strange moment of joy on a vessel built for violence, and it doesn't cancel out anything grim that's happened or is going to happen. But it's real, and it's worth noticing because the version of pirate life that survives in popular memory tends to flatten crews like this one into either romanticized adventurers or one-dimensional monsters, when the actual texture of the thing was messier, coercion and camaraderie occupying the same cramped deck, sometimes in the same hour. The shares get divided the following morning, and this is where the ship's internal fairness, such as it is, becomes concrete rather than theoretical. A captain like Teach typically took something in the range of 1.5 to 2 shares of any prize, compared to a single ordinary share for a common crewman, a meaningful premium, but nowhere near the 10 or 20 times difference in pay that separated a Royal Navy captain from an ordinary seaman of the same era. The quartermaster and other specialists, the surgeon among them, drew shares somewhere between the two. Elias, as a forced man rather than assigned one, doesn't draw a full share at all, which is its own quiet injustice worth naming rather than glossing over. The system's relative fairness applied most fully to those who'd agreed to the risk in the first place, and rather less to those who hadn't been given the choice. By the time 6 weeks have passed since you came aboard, the daily rhythm of it, the biscuit and the weevils, the watches, the careening, the vote, the rum on good nights, has stopped feeling like captivity in the moment-to-moment sense, even though it plainly still is one in the larger sense that matters. That's not a small thing to notice about yourself, and it isn't meant as praise for the system that produced it. It's simply what happens to people placed for long enough inside almost any rhythm, however strange. The rhythm starts to feel like life, rather than an interruption of it. Elias still hums his 3 or 4 notes when the work gets tedious. You've caught yourself doing it too, once or twice without meaning to. What none of you know yet, on this particular ordinary evening somewhere off the Carolina coast, is that the flotilla's next target isn't going to be a single ship at all. It's going to be an entire city, and the man giving the orders is about to become considerably more famous and considerably more feared than he already is. A merchant captain named onto a witness stand months later would describe the moment his ship was boarded in terms that read, even now, like something out of a nightmare rather than a robbery. A tall, powerfully built man came over the rail with a lit slow match tucked under the brim of his hat on either side of his face, so that thin curls of smoke rose up around his head as he moved, and a beard famously improbably long even by the standards of an era that tolerated considerably more facial hair than ours, braided into small plaits tied off with ribbons, some accounts claim, in a deliberately menacing arrangement around his ears. Pistols crossed his chest in a bandolier, more than any one man could reasonably need to fire in a single engagement. He did not, by most accounts of his career, need to say very much at all. The image did the talking. This is the story of Edward Teach, the man who became Blackbeard, and the uncomfortable truth that almost everything memorable about him was, quite deliberately, a performance built to make actual violence unnecessary. Who Teach was before he became that performance is genuinely difficult to pin down, and it's worth being honest about that difficulty rather than papering over it with false confidence. The most widely repeated account of his origins, that he was born in Bristol, England, likely sometime in the 1680s, comes down to us primarily through Captain Charles Johnson's A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724, a handful of years after Teach's death. Johnson's book is, without question, the single most influential source for almost everything the popular imagination believes about Golden Age piracy, and it is also a source whose own author's identity remains disputed among historians, and which is well documented to have dramatised, embellished, and in places likely invented dialogue and detail in service of a good story. That doesn't mean everything in it is false. It means every specific claim drawn from it, including Teach's hometown, deserves the same, according to legend, framing we'd apply to any second-hand story that can't be independently verified. What can be said with more confidence is that Teach almost certainly served as a privateer, a government-licensed raider, legally sanctioned to attack enemy shipping during the War of the Spanish Succession, known in the American colonies as Queen Anne's War, which ground to a close in 1713 and left thousands of men like him suddenly unemployed, trained in exactly one skill the peacetime economy had no legal use for anymore. The physical description that survives of Teach, incidentally, comes almost entirely from people who encountered him during exactly this kind of deliberate performance. A merchant captain mid-boarding, a frightened passenger recounting the ordeal weeks later, to a magistrate, rather than from anyone who knew him in a quiet, unguarded moment. That's worth remembering every time the smoke and the braided beard come up in this story, because it means we have almost no reliable account of what Edward Teach looked or sounded like on an ordinary evening, doing arithmetic at a desk by lamplight, the way we imagined him doing on that very first night of this script. The theatrical version is the only version that got written down at the time, because it was the only version his victims ever actually saw. Somewhere around 1716, Teach turns up in the historical record as part of the crew serving under Benjamin Hornigold, one of the senior captains operating out of Nassau in the Bahamas, a port that had, by this point, essentially stopped functioning as a legitimate colonial settlement and become something closer to an outlaw's free city. No effective governor, no functioning customs house. A natural, well-protected harbour that made it easy to careen ships and hard for any pursuing naval vessel to corner them. Historians have since nicknamed this period the Republic of Pirates, and while that phrase overstates how organised the arrangement actually was, there was no constitution, no elected pirate government. It captures something true about the scale of it. By some contemporary estimates, as many as 1,000 or more pirates moved through Nassau at the height of its use as a haven, trading plunder for supplies, drinking through their shares, and, crucially for Teach's career, forming and reforming crews and alliances with a fluidity that let an ambitious junior officer rise fast if he had the nerve for it. Teach had the nerve for it. Within roughly a year of joining Hornigold's crew, he had his own command. The name itself is worth pausing on. Contemporary sources of the period more often render it Thatch than Teach, and it's genuinely unclear which spelling, if either, matched what the man himself would have used to sign a document, since no confirmed signature of his survives in the record. What's not in dispute is the nickname that eclipsed whatever his given name actually was within a remarkably short span of time. Blackbeard. Simple, blunt, entirely descriptive, and, this is the part worth sitting with, almost certainly cultivated on purpose rather than simply observed and applied by others. A captain who wanted his targets to surrender without a fight had a direct financial incentive to look as terrifying as physically possible, because every ship that struck its colours on sight was a ship that didn't need to be damaged, chased, or fought for, preserving both the cargo's value and his own crew's safety in the same gesture. The lit matches under the hat, the braided beard, the crossed pistols, none of it added meaningful combat capability. All of it added fear, and fear, deployed correctly, is cheaper than gunpowder and considerably less likely to sink the prize you're trying to capture intact. That reputation, though, wasn't only aimed outward at frightened merchant captains. According to the same disputed but frequently repeated account in Johnson's General History, Teach was equally deliberate about managing fear within his own crew, and the anecdote most often cited to illustrate this is worth relaying with its uncertainty clearly attached rather than stated as settled fact. The story goes that one evening below decks, drinking with a small group that included his ship's master, Israel Hands, a real, documented officer aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge. Whatever the truth of this specific incident, Teach reportedly drew 2 pistols under the table without warning and fired, striking Hands in the knee and leaving him with a limp for the rest of his life. When asked why, Teach is said to have replied, in effect, that if he didn't shoot one of his own men now and then, they would forget who he was. Whether that exact exchange happened as described, happened in some looser form, or was invented wholesale by Johnson for dramatic effect, cannot be confirmed from independent sources, and it should be read with exactly that caveat. What can be said with more confidence? Because it's consistent with how fear-based command structures tend to actually function, is that a captain whose entire external strategy depended on projecting uncontrollable menace had every incentive to make sure his own crew believed that menace was genuine and not merely theatre reserved for outsiders. A performance only works if the people closest to the performer half believe it too. By early 1718, with Hornigold gone, and the flotilla under Teach's sole command, the man and the myth had become close to inseparable, and it's genuinely difficult, working from the surviving depositions and court records, to say with confidence where the calculated performance ended and whatever remained of the actual privateer from Bristol, or wherever he was actually from, began. This is, in its own way, the story of a man who built a weapon almost entirely out of reputation and then had to keep feeding it, escalation after escalation, because a fearsome image that stops growing starts shrinking, and a captain whose only real advantage is how terrifying he looks does not have the luxury of ever looking ordinary again. Charleston, in a matter of weeks, was about to become the largest stage that reputation had ever been tested on, and Teach, whatever his real name had once been, was clearly counting on the fear doing most of the actual work. Colonial governors up and down the American seaboard were, by early 1718, writing letters to London and to each other that read less like routine administrative correspondence and more like genuine alarm reports. Alexander Spotswood, the governor of Virginia, in particular corresponded repeatedly about the growing pirate threat along the coast, and Teach's name appears with increasing frequency in this kind of official traffic as the months pass. A useful reminder that Blackbeard wasn't purely a legend manufactured after the fact by Johnson's book. He was a genuine, contemporaneously documented security problem that working colonial governments spent real time and real correspondence worrying about while he was still alive and active, which is different and in some ways more interesting kind of evidence than any dramatised second-hand account could provide. Newspapers of the period, still a relatively new institution in the American colonies, picked up and reprinted reports of his movements as well, meaning that by the spring of 1718, a merchant captain in Boston or Philadelphia could plausibly have read about Blackbeard's exploits in a printed broadsheet before ever encountering anyone who'd actually seen him, an early small-scale version of a reputation travelling faster than the man attached to it, which is essentially the entire engine his strategy depended on. It's worth understanding, too, just how narrow the window for a career like Teach's actually was by 1718. because it sharpens exactly why the Charleston operation mattered so much to him strategically. The same Woodes Rogers, whose imminent arrival had helped drive Hornigold toward a pardon, did in fact take up his post as the newly appointed royal governor of the Bahamas within months of Teach's Charleston blockade, arriving with naval support and a mandate to end Nassau's decade as a functioning pirate haven for good. And he largely succeeded within a remarkably short span of time, either persuading or forcing the majority of pirates still operating out of the port to accept pardons or flee elsewhere. The world that had allowed a junior officer like Teach to rise to independent command within roughly a year of joining Hornigold's crew was, by the time of the Charleston blockade, already closing rapidly around men exactly like him. Every additional colonial governor writing anxious letters to London, every additional naval patrol assigned to hunt pirate flotillas down, every additional merchant captain who'd learned to strike his colours on sight rather than risk a fight, represented one more sign that the loosely governed, semi-tolerated pirate economy of the preceding decade was running out of road. Teach's escalation towards something as audacious as holding an entire provincial capital hostage wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was happening in part because the easier version of this career, quietly robbing merchant shipping and retreating to a friendly port to spend the proceeds, was becoming considerably harder to sustain with each passing month. Before Charleston, there's a smaller episode worth knowing, because it shows the performance working exactly as designed on a considerably less famous stage. In the spring of 1718, somewhere in the waters near the Bay of Honduras and the Tenerife Islands, Teach's flotilla came across several vessels, among them a sloop out of Havana and a Jamaican merchant ship, and took them with what the surviving accounts describe as minimal resistance. No pitched battle, no desperate broadside exchange. Just the black flag run up, the ship in question recognizing exactly whose flotilla was closing on them, and a surrender negotiated in the time it takes to lower a boat. Crews from captured vessels in this period increasingly understood correctly that fighting Blackbeard's ships brought them nothing but damage and casualties, since the outcome was rarely in serious doubt once his flag was identified. Here's the thing about a reputation built this effectively. It starts to generate its own evidence. Every ship that surrendered without a fight became one more story, merchant captains told each other in port, which made the next ship even more likely to surrender without a fight, which meant Teach genuinely didn't need to win many close engagements to keep the machine running. By the time he set his sights on Charleston, he had spent the better part of 2 years demonstrating, again and again, that his name alone was worth more than most captains' entire broadsides. It's worth noting, too, that for all his fearsome reputation, the surviving record contains remarkably few documented instances of Teach actually killing prisoners or captured crews in cold blood, a detail that cuts against the purely bloodthirsty caricature later fiction sometimes prefers. His violence, where it's genuinely documented rather than legendary, tended to be tactical rather than gratuitous, aimed at securing compliance and preserving his own reputation for effectiveness rather than indulging in cruelty for its own sake. That distinction mattered practically as much as morally. A captain known for slaughtering surrendered crews indiscriminately would have given every future target a reason to fight to the death, instead of striking colours, since a doomed man has nothing left to lose by resisting. Fear, deployed as a business strategy rather than pure sadism, required a certain grim consistency: punish resistance, reward surrender, and let word of both spread. It's an uncomfortable kind of rationality to find sitting underneath so theatrical a reputation, but it likely explains, better than any account of pure savagery could, how a man commanding a floating small town's worth of armed men managed to extract so much plunder from so many encounters with comparatively so little actual bloodshed along the way. One more piece of the Teach legend deserves specific mention here, precisely because it's repeated so often as settled fact when it is anything but. The claim, again traceable to Johnson's account and the folklore that grew up around it, that Blackbeard married as many as 13 or 14 wives over the course of his career, several of them simultaneously, in ports up and down the coast. It's a vivid detail, and it has made its way into an enormous number of popular retellings, with barely a hedge attached. The honest position, though, is that this claim rests on thin, largely second-hand evidence, mixes at least one documented marriage to a young woman in North Carolina later in 1718, which we'll get to before the night is through, with a great deal of unverified rumour and should be treated as legend rather than biography until better evidence surfaces. It's a useful example in miniature of how the entire Blackbeard story works. A kernel of documented fact, wrapped in decades of embellishment that was often more entertaining than the truth, repeated so many times across so many books and films that the embellishment starts to feel indistinguishable from the record itself. Tonight, we're trying to hold both halves of that in view at once. The real man, thin and disputed as the record of him is, and the performance he built on top of himself, which turned out to be so effective it's still working on audiences 300 years later. What that performance was about to attempt against Charleston, though, was entirely real and entirely documented down to the names of the hostages he took. The sound reaches you before anything else does. A single cannon shot across the bow of the ship you're travelling on, the Crowley, bound out of Charleston for London with a hold full of cargo and a small handful of passengers, yourself among them. It's late May of 1718, and for a moment the shot could almost be mistaken for something else, some accident of another vessel's gunnery drill. It is not an accident. 4 ships have appeared across the mouth of the harbour entrance, and one of them is flying a flag with a horned skeleton on it, and every sailor aboard the Crowley knows exactly what that means before the captain even finishes giving the order to strike her colours. You feel the ship go still under your feet in that particular way. A vessel goes still when its crew has just decided that fighting is not an option. Welcome to the single worst week Charleston, South Carolina is going to have in the entire year of 1718. You're not alone in your fear, and that turns out to matter more than you'd expect. Among the passengers taken off captured vessels over the following days is Samuel Wragg, a member of the colony's governing council and one of Charleston's more prominent citizens, travelling with a young relative, his son by most accounts, though a few sources describe the child as a nephew, and the surviving record isn't entirely consistent on the exact relationship, so it's worth holding that detail loosely rather than stating it as settled fact. What isn't in dispute is that a child, not yet school age by most reconstructions, is now among the hostages aboard a pirate flagship, and that fact alone is going to do more to bring Charleston to the negotiating table than any amount of cannon fire could have managed on its own. Over the course of roughly a week, Teach's flotilla stops and boards somewhere in the range of 8 or 9 vessels attempting to enter or leave the harbour, taking prisoners from several of them and holding the port's entire shipping trade hostage in the process. An economic stranglehold as much as a physical one, since Charleston in 1718 depended almost entirely on seaborne trade for both imports and its export economy, built heavily on rice and naval stores bound for Britain. You're transferred, along with Wragg and several other hostages, onto the Queen Anne's Revenge herself, and the hold you're kept in is nothing like the cabin conditions you travelled in aboard the Crowley. Cramped, dim, smelling of bilge and unwashed bodies, with barely enough room to lie down among the other prisoners. Nobody strikes you. Nobody, as far as you can tell, intends to, so long as Charleston does what it's told, but the not knowing is its own particular kind of exhausting terror, and it doesn't ease with time the way you might expect. If anything, it sharpens, because every hour that passes is an hour in which the demand hasn't yet been met, and an hour in which a captain with a documented reputation for volatility has that much more time to decide patience isn't working. Somewhere nearby, you can hear the young Wragg child crying intermittently, and one of the pirate crew, not a kind man by any obvious measure, but not a cruel one in this particular moment either, brings the boy a small ration of biscuit and, according to the account that survives from this incident, speaks to him gently enough that the crying eventually stops. It's a strange thing to be grateful for, gentleness from your own captor. You're grateful for it anyway. It's worth noting too that not every ship stopped during that week off Charleston surrendered its passengers to the same fate you experienced. Several vessels were boarded, searched briefly for anything of immediate value, and released within hours once it became clear they carried nothing the flotilla particularly needed. A reminder that even at the height of the blockade, Teach's operation remained oddly selective rather than indiscriminately cruel, targeting specific hostages and specific cargo with the same calculated precision he'd applied to the ransom demand itself. Terror, deployed as strategy rather than simple chaos, tends to look this way up close, focused, almost bureaucratic in its choices, even while it feels, from inside the hold of a captured ship, like nothing but pure, formless dread. The demand itself, when it's finally delivered ashore, is stranger and more specific than a simple ransom for gold would have been. Teach wants a chest of medicine, bandages, purgatives, and, this era being what it was, very likely compounds used to treat venereal disease and the tropical fevers that had been working through his crew of several hundred men for months. Reports of the value place it somewhere around £300 to £400 sterling, a genuinely significant sum for the period, roughly equivalent to what a skilled tradesman might earn across several years of ordinary work. And the threat attached to the demand is chillingly direct. Deliver the chest, or the hostages, Rag and the child among them, will be killed and their heads sent ashore as proof. It is, even by the standards of Golden Age piracy, an unusually calculated piece of coercion, not simple robbery, but a targeted extraction of exactly the one resource the flotilla couldn't easily obtain any other way, backed by the one threat guaranteed to move an entire city government faster than any amount of lost cargo would have. Charleston, it's worth understanding, was not an easy target chosen at random. The city had already spent the better part of a decade dealing with pirate activity along its approaches. A captain named Charles Vane had harassed shipping near the same harbour entrance only months earlier, and the colony's merchants had grown increasingly vocal about the provincial government's inability to protect the trade the entire economy depended on. Rice exports alone, the backbone of South Carolina's wealth by this point, moved almost exclusively by sea, and a week of sealed harbour access represented a genuinely significant economic wound, layered on top of the raw terror of the hostage-taking itself. You can hear it if you listen closely to the murmured conversations among the other prisoners in the hold, in how much of the fear circling around you is actually about money and reputation, as much as it is about survival. Merchants aboard worrying aloud about spoiling cargo, about contracts they'll fail to honour, about a colony that already has a reputation problem, with London investors taking on yet another black mark. Terror, it turns out, rarely arrives alone. It brings its accountant with it. What became of the young Rag child in the years after this ordeal is not something the surviving record follows in much detail, which is itself a small telling fact about whose lives colonial record-keeping bothered to track closely and whose it didn't. Samuel Rag himself continued to serve in prominent public roles in South Carolina for years afterward, his standing seemingly undamaged, and perhaps even burnished, by having survived so public and so widely discussed a captivity. The child grew up somewhere in the shadow of that story, presumably hearing it retold at family gatherings for the rest of his life, a strange kind of inherited fame attached to an experience he was almost certainly too young to remember clearly on his own. It's worth imagining for a moment what that must have been like, carrying, second-hand, an ordeal that shaped how an entire city understood itself, without ever quite possessing your own memory of having lived through it. By the third day of the blockade, word has spread through Charleston that the harbour is effectively sealed, and the reaction ashore, as later accounts describe it, is closer to citywide panic than measured concern. South Carolina in 1718 has no real naval force of its own capable of challenging 4 armed pirate vessels, one of them carrying something in the range of 40 guns. The colony's governor, Robert Johnson, finds himself in the uncomfortable position of having essentially no military tool available to answer the crisis with. Appeals to send help from other colonies would take far longer than the standoff itself, and any attempt to force the issue risks the deaths of hostages the government has a direct obligation to protect, several of them in Rag's case drawn from the colony's own governing class. It is, in miniature, a demonstration of exactly how much leverage a well-armed pirate flotilla could exert over a colonial port that, for all its wealth, had no meaningful way to project force onto the water in front of its own harbour. Here's the thing about a blockade like this one. It doesn't need to be sustainable for months. It only needs to be sustainable for a few days, because a few days is more than enough to make an entire city's shipping economy grind to a halt and its government start weighing options it would never otherwise consider. Governor Johnson's response to the whole humiliating episode, once the immediate crisis had passed, was not to simply absorb the loss and move on. Charleston's governing council, furious at having been forced to negotiate at all, began pushing almost immediately for a more aggressive, self-funded approach to piracy along the colony's coastline, arguing that waiting on distant naval support from Britain was no longer an acceptable strategy for a colony this exposed. That shift in posture would matter enormously within a matter of months, when the same council authorised Colonel William Rhett to hunt down Stede Bonnet with everything the colony could muster, the very expedition, as it happens, that would end with Bonnet's capture and eventual execution at White Point, in the same city he'd helped hold hostage. Charleston, in other words, didn't simply survive the blockade. It emerged from the experience considerably more willing to spend its own money and risk its own men chasing pirates down rather than waiting for someone else to do it, a hardening of resolve that Teach's demonstration of the city's vulnerability had, ironically, helped bring about. There's a quiet moment worth holding on to from somewhere in the middle of that long, frightened wait, because it's the kind of detail that gets lost entirely if this story is told only in terms of ships and demands and ransom sums. An older hostage among you, a merchant's widow travelling to settle a late husband's affairs in England, falls seriously ill sometime during the second day in the hold. Fever, most likely brought on by the damp, cramped conditions rather than anything more sinister, but frightening enough in a space with no real medical care available. Samuel Wragg, despite his own understandable preoccupation with the young relative beside him, spends a good portion of that day tending to her as best he can, holding a cup of brackish water to her lips, keeping her propped against a barrel so she can breathe more easily. It costs him nothing strategically. Nobody aboard is keeping score of kindness in a way that will change the ransom demand one way or the other. He does it anyway, because that is apparently the kind of man he is, and because even inside a hold full of frightened strangers on a pirate ship, some people simply can't help but look after whoever's nearest and worse off than themselves. It doesn't fix anything. It doesn't make the wait shorter or the threat less real. But it's the kind of small, unrewarded decency that tends to survive in memory long after the political outcome of the blockade itself has faded into a paragraph in a history book, and it's worth telling for exactly that reason. 2 men are eventually sent ashore under a flag of truce to collect the ransom. Accounts differ on exactly how many and precisely who, though at least one hostage was reportedly sent along with them as a further guarantee of good faith. What should have been a straightforward errand turns into a prolonged, nerve-shredding delay. The messengers do not return promptly, and as the hours stretch past what anyone aboard the flagship considers reasonable, tension aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge climbs sharply. You can feel it in the way the crew's voices change, in how much more often someone checks the horizon toward the harbour mouth. Teach, according to the surviving accounts of the episode, grows visibly furious at the delay, and for a stretch of hours that feels considerably longer than it probably was, it seems entirely plausible that his earlier threat against the hostages might actually be carried out. You spend that stretch of hours doing very little except listening, and trying, without much success, not to think too specifically about what a threat like that would actually look like carried out on a child not yet 5 years old. It emerges later that the delay wasn't a refusal at all, but the ordinary friction of moving a specific, unusual request through a colonial government that had never faced a demand quite like this one, locating and assembling a chest of medical supplies of the right value on short notice, in a period before anything like a standing pharmaceutical supply chain existed, apparently took considerably longer than anyone aboard the flotilla had patience for. What happens is not the worst outcome. The medicine chest is delivered. According to the account that survives, the hostages are released largely unharmed, though stripped in some cases of money and fine clothing on the way off the ship, a small, almost petty final indignity tacked onto the end of a genuinely terrifying week. You come back up onto the Crowley's deck, or whatever remains of your original vessel's crew and cargo, blinking in daylight that feels unfamiliar after days in a dim hold, and the first thing you notice, oddly, is how quiet the harbour has gone. The other 3 ships are already turning. Within hours, the flotilla that held an entire city's shipping trade hostage for the better part of a week is gone, sailing north along the coast, taking with it a chest of bandages and mercury salts that, weighed against everything the blockade cost Charleston in fear, cargo and delayed trade, seems almost absurdly small. Samuel Wragg makes it back to his position on the governing council, and the young relative who spent a week aboard a pirate ship grows up, presumably, with a story that very few children of the era could match, disputed exact relation and all. You make it back to whatever life you had before the Crowley left port, changed in some quiet, hard-to-name way that a week of genuine, sustained terror tends to leave behind. Relief, when it finally arrives, doesn't feel the way you'd expect it to. It feels less like joy, and more like the sudden absence of a weight you'd stopped noticing you were carrying because it had never once let up long enough for you to remember what it felt like without it. Charleston, for its part, does not forget the humiliation quickly, and within a matter of months, the city's fury at having been held hostage in its own harbour is going to find a target considerably closer to home than Edward Teach, a wealthy, unlikely pirate captain who, at this very moment, is sailing north alongside the Queen Anne's Revenge, about to become far more useful to Teach's plans than he currently understands. By the last week of September 1718, a wounded man crouches behind a shattered section of rail aboard a sloop called the Royal James, anchored in the mouth of the Cape Fear River, while grapeshot and musket fire tear through the rigging above him. He has been fighting government forces under a colonel named William Rhett for the better part of 5 hours, in a running close-range engagement that has left both sides bloodied and several men dead on his own deck alone. He is not by trade or training a sailor at all. A few years earlier, this same man owned one of the more comfortable sugar estates on the island of Barbados, held a respected commission as a major in the local militia, and by every account that survives of his life before piracy, was regarded by his neighbours as a sober, educated, entirely unremarkable gentleman of means. This is the story of Stede Bonnet, the wealthiest and least likely pirate captain of the entire Golden Age, and the strange self-destructive arc that carried him from a Barbados plantation house to a Charleston gallows in barely 2 years. Bonnet's decision to turn pirate sometime in the spring of 1717 is one of the more genuinely puzzling character turns in the whole era, and the historical record doesn't offer a fully satisfying answer for why he did it. He had money. He had land. He had by most accounts no meaningful debts forcing his hand and no criminal record pushing him toward outlawry, the way it pushed so many other men of the period. The explanation most often repeated, again traceable primarily to Johnson's general history, and worth exactly the same, according to legend caution we've applied to every other Johnson-sourced claim tonight, is that Bonnet's marriage had become deeply unhappy, and that piracy offered him an escape from a domestic situation he found unbearable, a motive Johnson himself frames in slightly mocking terms, describing Bonnet's turn to crime as a kind of midlife derangement rather than a rational choice. Whatever the true cause, what Bonnet did next was almost comically unlike how any other pirate captain of the era operated. Rather than seizing a vessel by force or joining an existing crew, he simply purchased his own sloop outright, named her the Revenge, and recruited a crew of roughly 70 men, whom he then proceeded to pay in wages, like hired hands aboard a merchant ship, rather than offering the shares and voted articles that bound every other pirate crew of the period together. It is, in its own way, the pirate equivalent of a man buying a motorcycle gang membership with a corporate salary structure attached. It did not go especially well. Bonnet's inexperience showed almost immediately, and it showed in a way that mattered enormously once he crossed paths with Edward Teach off the Bay of Honduras in the autumn of 1717. A captain with no sailing background, however wealthy, however well-read in the theory of naval command, was at a genuine and dangerous disadvantage running an actual ship in actual combat, and the surviving accounts suggest Bonnet had already been wounded in at least one earlier engagement before the two captains' paths crossed. Teach, watching an inexperienced but well-resourced rival struggling to hold his own crew's confidence, made what was, from a purely strategic standpoint, an obvious move. He proposed an alliance, and then, having secured it, quietly restructured the actual chain of command. Bonnet was invited aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge as something between a guest and a hostage of politeness, treated with courtesy befitting his wealth and social standing, given comfortable quarters, and relieved in practice of any real authority over his own sloop. Teach installed one of his own trusted men, a pirate named Richards, to actually command the Revenge in Bonnet's name, while Bonnet himself spent the following months as, functionally, a well-dressed passenger aboard the very flotilla he had once imagined himself appear within. It's a genuinely uncomfortable dynamic to sit with, because Bonnet's own crew almost certainly understood what was happening, even if Bonnet himself was slow to fully accept it. Here's the thing about a gentleman used to command by birthright rather than by earned trust. The loss of it doesn't always register the way it should, and Bonnet, according to the accounts of men who later testified about their time aboard, spent a considerable stretch of this period behaving as though nothing fundamental had changed, dining well, dressing in fine clothes salvaged from prizes, and largely deferring to Teach's judgment on operational matters, without apparently grasping how thoroughly his own authority had been hollowed out from underneath him. When the flotilla arrived off Charleston in May of 1718 and staged the blockade you already heard about, Bonnet was aboard, present for the entire operation, and yet almost entirely absent from any account of the decisions that shaped it. A strange kind of ghost captain, technically an equal partner in one of the most audacious pirate operations of the era, practically a spectator to his own supposed command. Before falling in with Teach, Bonnet had already managed a short, independent run at piracy along the American coast in the summer of 1717, and the results, by most accounts, were middling at best. He took a handful of prizes off Virginia and the Carolinas, burned at least one captured vessel rather than keeping her. An oddly vindictive touch some historians have connected back to whatever grievance drove him to sea in the first place, since burning a prize rather than selling her cargo or pressing her into service made little practical sense for a captain supposedly motivated by profit. His wage-paying crew, unusual as it was, also proved to be a persistent weakness rather than the innovation Bonnet may have imagined it to be. Men signed on for fixed pay had considerably less personal stake in the ship's success than men sailing under articles for a genuine share of the plunder, and desertion, by several accounts, was a recurring problem aboard the Revenge. In a way it rarely was on properly organised pirate vessels, where every man's own payout depended directly on the ship's performance. It's a small, almost accidental economics lesson buried inside a pirate biography. The profit-sharing model that Golden Age pirate crews stumbled into out of practical necessity turned out to align individual incentive with collective success far more effectively than Bonnet's more conventional wage arrangement ever managed to, 3 centuries before anyone would think to write that observation down in a business textbook. The full extent of what Teach had done to him became clear only after the flotilla left Charleston behind and moved north into North Carolina waters, where, as we'll cover in detail shortly, Teach ran the Queen Anne's Revenge aground, and used the resulting chaos to strip away a considerable share of the flotilla's crew and plunder for himself and a small inner circle. Bonnet, at the time this happened, was away from the main flotilla, having sailed a captured sloop up to Bath, North Carolina, to negotiate his own royal pardon from Governor Charles Eden, a pardon he received sometime in June of 1718, apparently in good faith, intending to leave piracy behind entirely and return to some version of his old, respectable life. When he came back to rejoin what remained of his flotilla shortly afterward, he discovered the Revenge stripped of most of her provisions and plunder, her most experienced hands gone, and Teach himself long departed with the lion's share of everything the Alliance had accumulated. It is difficult to overstate how thoroughly Bonnet had been used. A wealthy, well-meaning, hopelessly out of his depth gentleman had bankrolled a chunk of one of the era's most notorious pirate operations, been quietly stripped of command over his own ship for the better part of a year, participated unknowingly in the humiliation of an entire city, and emerged from the entire arrangement with barely more than the sloop he'd started with, considerably worse for wear. What Bonnet did next is the part of his story that turns from tragedy into something closer to genuine self-destruction. Rather than simply accepting his pardon and returning to Barbados or settling quietly somewhere in the colonies, he went back to piracy almost immediately, sailing under the alias Captain Thomas, apparently unable or unwilling to let go of the identity he'd spent over a year building, however hollow that identity had turned out to be underneath. This is the story, in the end, of a man who couldn't return to the ordinary life he'd left behind, even when the ordinary life was, by any reasonable measure, considerably safer and more comfortable than the one that was about to get him killed. Colonial authorities in South Carolina, still furious over the Charleston blockade and eager to make an example of somebody connected to it, dispatched Colonel William Rhett with 2 armed sloops to hunt Bonnet down specifically. They found him in late September 1718 anchored in the Cape Fear River, and the resulting battle, the same engagement described a few minutes ago, ran for hours before Bonnet, wounded and out of options, finally struck his colours and surrendered. The battle at Cape Fear River that finally brought Bonnet down was, by the standards of most pirate engagements of the era, an unusually protracted and costly affair for both sides. Colonel Rhett's 2 sloops, the Henry and the Sea Nymph, both ran aground themselves during the approach, a reminder of just how treacherous these shallow coastal inlets were for any vessel, hunter or hunted, that didn't know their shifting sandbars intimately, and the fight that followed, once the tide floated everyone free again, was conducted at close range with small arms and cannon for the better part of 5 hours. Casualties were significant on both sides. Several of Bonny's men were killed outright, and Rhett's forces suffered losses as well, a detail that undercuts the tidy image of pirates as inevitably overmatched amateurs whenever the authorities finally caught up with them. Bonnet fought by every surviving account with genuine and somewhat startling ferocity for a man with so little actual combat experience, refusing to surrender until his position had become completely untenable, a last desperate flash of the resolve that had never quite translated into competent command over the preceding year and a half. The men who sailed with Bonnet and were captured alongside him at Cape Fear faced their own trials in Charleston that same autumn, and their fates offer a useful, sobering counterpoint to Bonnet's own relatively well-documented final weeks. Roughly 30 of his crew were tried in a batch proceeding shortly before Bonnet's own separate trial, and the overwhelming majority were convicted and hanged within days of sentencing, a swift, largely undocumented mass execution that left far less trace in the historical record than Bonnet's own more sympathetic, more thoroughly chronicled downfall, precisely because a wealthy former militia major generated considerably more paperwork, correspondence, and public interest than the ordinary sailors who'd served under him. It's worth sitting with that asymmetry for a moment. The same colonial justice system capable of genuine nuance in the marooned men's later cases about the difference between coercion and choice showed considerably less patience for that same distinction when the men in question weren't gentlemen with connections and a sympathetic personal story attached. History remembers Stede Bonnet by name, in loving and mocking detail both, largely because he was rich enough and unusual enough to be worth writing about. Most of the men who died beside him left barely a name in the court record at all. Bonnet's trial took place in Charleston that autumn, the very city his flotilla had held hostage barely 5 months earlier, and the irony of that fact was almost certainly not lost on anyone in the courtroom. He attempted at one stage to escape custody and was recaptured within days, hiding on a nearby island in conditions that later accounts describe with a certain grim pathos. A man who had once owned a Barbados sugar estate reduced to scavenging on a marsh island, waiting to be found. He wrote, according to surviving correspondence, a series of increasingly desperate letters pleading for clemency, appealing to his prior good character and his status as a gentleman rather than a common criminal, arguments that had worked reasonably well for men of his class in other contexts and worked not at all here. The court was unmoved. On the 10th of December, 1718, Stede Bonnet was hanged at White Point in Charleston, alongside a number of his surviving crew, in a public execution attended by a large crowd of the same colonists his flotilla had terrorized during the blockade. Bonnet's own letters from prison, several of which survive in the colonial record, offer a rare glimpse into how at least one Golden Age pirate understood his own downfall, and they make for genuinely uncomfortable reading, precisely because they show so little of the self-awareness his situation seemed to call for. He wrote at length about his prior good character, his military service, his standing among Barbados society, seemingly convinced that reminding the court of who he'd been before piracy might outweigh what he'd actually done since, an argument that reads, from 3 centuries' distance, less like a legal strategy and more like a man who had never fully processed how completely he'd forfeited the social standing he kept appealing to. There's no surviving evidence he ever meaningfully reckoned with the men who died under his command, or the fear his flotilla had inflicted on Charleston during the blockade he'd participated in as a ghost captain. Whatever drove him to sea in the first place, whatever unhappiness Johnson's account gestures toward, Bonnet went to the gallows still apparently believing that his birth and breeding ought to have counted for more than they did. There's a particular kind of sadness to Bonnet's story that sets him apart from almost every other figure in this script, precisely because so little about it feels inevitable. He wasn't pressed into piracy the way Josiah Cobb or Elias Grant were. He wasn't a hardened former privateer with no other trade, the way Teach likely was. He had every reasonable path back to an ordinary, comfortable life available to him, more than once, and chose piracy anyway, apparently unable to walk away from an identity that had never actually served him well, even while he held it. Popular memory has settled on calling him the Gentleman Pirate, a title that sounds almost admiring, until you sit with the actual arc it describes, a wealthy, educated man who gambled everything he had on a life he was never suited for, got quietly exploited by a far more capable operator for the better part of a year and paid for the entire arrangement with his life while the man who'd used him sailed off with most of the profit. Teach, as it happens, was doing considerably better for himself at exactly this moment, having just pulled off one of the more calculated betrayals of his entire career against his own loyal crew. The water off Topsail Inlet, on the North Carolina coast, is a pale, shifting turquoise in the early June sun, and after weeks of open ocean and the tension of the Charleston blockade, the sight of it feels almost like a reward. You can smell marsh grass on the wind now instead of nothing but salt and tar, and somewhere off the starboard rail gulls wheel low over water, shallow enough to see straight through to a sandy bottom. Josiah Cobb, the forced carpenter you met on the first night of this story, stands near you at the rail, and for the first time in weeks he looks something close to relaxed. Land this close usually means a careening, a few days of hard, filthy work followed by rest and better food. It's the closest thing to a routine, comforting moment this flotilla has offered him in a long while. It's also, though nobody aboard fully understands this yet, the beginning of the single most calculated betrayal Edward Teach commits in his entire career, and it's about to be aimed directly at the crew standing on this deck. The Queen Anne's Revenge runs aground not long after, her deep-laden hull catching on a sandbar in what should have been, by every account given afterward, entirely navigable water for a pilot who knew the inlet. That detail matters enormously, and it's worth sitting with rather than rushing past. This was not unfamiliar coastline to Teach's crew. They had operated in these waters before, and conditions on the day of the grounding were, by surviving testimony, calm and clear, nothing like the kind of sudden squall or fog that might genuinely explain an experienced ship running onto a sandbar by accident. When Ignatius Pell, the flotilla's boatswain, was later questioned under oath about the incident, his account left considerable room for the interpretation that historians have increasingly leaned toward in the centuries since, that the grounding was not an accident at all, but a deliberate manoeuvre engineered by Teach to create exactly the chaos he needed for what came next. A second vessel, one of the flotilla's sloops sent to assist, ran aground shortly afterward as well, an oddly convenient second failure that further thinned the number of working vessels and, not coincidentally, the number of men Teach was going to need to find room for going forward. By the second day stranded at the inlet, with the Queen Anne's Revenge sitting hard and immovable on the sandbar and salvage efforts clearly going nowhere, Teach calls the crew together and makes an announcement that in hindsight explains everything about what's about to happen. The flotilla, he says, is too large and too conspicuous to keep operating as it has been. Word of the Charleston blockade has spread fast, and colonial authorities up and down the coast are looking for exactly this collection of ships. What he doesn't say quite so plainly, but what becomes obvious within hours, is that a smaller crew also means a considerably larger individual share of everything the flotilla has accumulated over the past year for whoever remains aboard when the sorting is finished. He announces that only a limited number of men, somewhere in the neighbourhood of 40, drawn overwhelmingly from his own longest-serving and most trusted hands, will continue aboard the Adventure, the flotilla's remaining functional sloop. Everyone else stays behind. You watch the selection happen in real time, and it does not take long to understand which category you fall into. Forced men go first, unsurprisingly, since they were never part of the crew's inner trust to begin with. Josiah Cobb's name is not called. Neither is yours. The particular men Teach chooses to keep aboard the Adventure tell their own quiet story about what he actually valued after 2 years of building a flotilla out of forced men, opportunists, and genuine believers in the ship's articles alike. Israel Hands makes the cut, unsurprisingly, given his standing as master and the trust Teach had placed in him since well before the Concord capture. A handful of the flotilla's most experienced gunners and navigators go with him too, men whose specific hard-won skills would be difficult to replace on short notice, and whose loyalty had been tested across enough engagements that Teach apparently judged the risk of keeping them worth the smaller number of shares he'd now need to divide. What's notably absent from the final roster, beyond the forced men like you and Josiah Cobb, is almost anyone who had joined the flotilla only recently, in the weeks around the Charleston blockade, new recruits drawn by the flotilla's growing fame, who Teach evidently regarded as expendable precisely because their loyalty, unlike Hans's, had never actually been tested under real pressure. It's a coldly practical piece of triage dressed up as a strategic necessity, and it tells you almost everything you need to know about how Teach actually thought about the several hundred men who'd made his reputation possible, useful for exactly as long as they remained useful, and not one day longer. Not every historian who has studied this episode agrees the grounding was deliberate, and it's worth representing that disagreement honestly rather than flattening it into a settled conclusion just because the deliberate betrayal reading makes for a cleaner story. A minority view holds that navigating a heavily laden, deep-draft former slave ship through an unfamiliar and genuinely treacherous inlet was simply dangerous enough on its own that an accidental grounding remains entirely plausible, without requiring any conspiracy on Teach's part at all. Shifting sandbars of exactly this kind claimed plenty of far more experienced, far better piloted vessels throughout the colonial period, deliberate sabotage or not. What tips the balance for most modern historians toward the deliberate reading isn't any single piece of definitive proof, since no confession survives, but the pattern of everything that happened immediately afterward, the suspiciously convenient second grounding, the abrupt announcement restructuring the crew, and the fact that Teach emerged from the whole episode considerably richer and considerably less encumbered by other men's claims on the plunder than he'd been the day before. Correlation isn't proof. But when a ship runs aground in calm, familiar water, and the captain walks away from the wreckage with a smaller crew and a larger personal share, the coincidence asks harder questions than it answers. Roughly 25 men, by most reconstructions of the event, are left standing on the deck of a grounded listing ship, while a much smaller group boards the Adventure alongside Teach, carrying with them the overwhelming bulk of the flotilla's accumulated plunder, coin, goods, and provisions that, under the ship's own voted articles, should by rights have been divided among every man who'd sailed and fought for it. Here's the bad news, delivered without a hint of apology. Those articles, the ones that promised roughly equal shares and a genuine vote in how the crew was governed, apply only for as long as the man holding the largest share finds it convenient to honour them. Teach simply stops honouring them, and there is no quartermaster, no vote, no appeal available to the men left behind to stop him. There's a broader irony sitting underneath this entire episode worth naming before we move on, because it connects the marooning directly to the political currents running through the whole Atlantic pirate world in 1718. This same royal pardon that Teach himself would soon collect in Bath was, in principle, available to every one of the men he'd just abandoned on that sandbar. The amnesty applied to any pirate willing to surrender and quit the trade, forced men and volunteers alike, provided they could reach a magistrate willing to process the paperwork before their window closed. For men like Josiah Cobb, stranded and provisionless on an isolated stretch of coastline, that pardon was somewhere between a genuine lifeline and a cruel joke, since it required first surviving long enough and reaching civilization fast enough to actually claim it. Some of the marooned men who eventually made it to shore did exactly that, presenting themselves to North Carolina or Virginia authorities, and receiving the same formal amnesty their former captain was simultaneously securing for himself a short distance away. A strange kind of parallel redemption, playing out on opposite ends of the same betrayal, without either party necessarily aware the other was pursuing an identical outcome at the very same time. The marooning that follows is not the single man on a desert island cliché of pirate fiction, but it is genuinely dangerous in its own right. Rather than being simply abandoned aboard the wrecked Queen Anne's Revenge itself, you and the roughly 24 other discarded men are put ashore on a small, sandy, largely uninhabited stretch near the inlet. Not a deserted tropical island in the romantic sense, but close enough to isolated marsh and open water that reaching help without a boat is a genuine problem, not a minor inconvenience. Provisions left behind are minimal. There's no guarantee anyone in the nearby settlements even knows you're there, and North Carolina's coastline in 1718 is sparsely populated enough that nearby can still mean a considerable distance on foot through marsh and scrub. Josiah Cobb, standing beside you on the sand as the Adventure grows smaller against the horizon, doesn't say much. He takes out the chalk stub from his coat pocket, the one he's used to mark every day since he was taken off his own ship back in April, and for the first time since you've known him, he doesn't make a new mark. There doesn't seem to be much point in counting toward a share he now understands he was never actually going to receive. You think, standing on that sand with the Adventure shrinking against the horizon, about the ship's articles one more time, the vote, the equal shares, the promised payout for a lost limb, and about how completely they depended this whole time on nothing more solid than one man's willingness to keep honouring them. It's a lesson that applies well beyond this particular sandbar if you're inclined to sit with it. Any system of fairness that exists only at the pleasure of whoever holds the most power within it isn't really a guarantee at all, just a courtesy that can be withdrawn the moment it stops being convenient. The men who built and voted on those articles weren't naive about that risk in the abstract. They simply hadn't expected it to be their own captain, rather than some outside enemy, who eventually tested it. What happens over the following days is the part of this story that tends to get compressed into a single sentence in most retellings, when it deserves considerably more weight. 20-some men, several of them forced aboard against their will in the first place, now abandoned on an isolated stretch of Carolina coastline, with minimal food and no clear way off. Some accounts suggest a handful eventually found or built a small boat, capable of reaching the mainland. Others describe men wading and swimming across shallower stretches of water at low tide, a genuinely dangerous undertaking for anyone not a strong swimmer. What isn't in serious dispute is that this marooning is where much of the surviving testimony against Teach's later activities actually originates. Men like Ignatius Pell, who eventually made it to safety and facing legal jeopardy of their own for having sailed under a pirate flag, testified in detail about exactly what had happened at the inlet. Testimony that would later help convict several of Teach's associates and paint a considerably less flattering picture of the captain than his carefully cultivated reputation allowed. Betrayal, it turns out, makes for excellent witnesses. There is, in the middle of all this, one small point of genuine hope worth naming, because the emotional register of this entire night shouldn't tip entirely into despair even here, at what is arguably the darkest turn in the whole script. The men left on that sandbar were not, in the end, entirely without resource or without each other. Oyster beds and shellfish, abundant along that stretch of coastline, provided food that required no tools beyond bare hands and a willingness to eat something unfamiliar. Rainwater collected in whatever containers had been left behind or improvised, and the men themselves, forced together by circumstance rather than choice, appear from the surviving fragments of testimony to have organised themselves with a rough practical cooperation, sharing what little there was, taking turns on lookout for any passing vessel, the same instinct for mutual reliance that had governed their lives under the ship's articles reasserting itself, even after the articles themselves had been abandoned by the one man with the power to enforce them. Josiah Cobb, in whatever fragmentary account of his fate survives in the margins of this story, is among those later recorded as having reached the mainland safely, working his way eventually back to a trade he actually chose, carpentry, on his own terms, in a small Carolina port town, where, one imagines, he kept no more chalk marks on any wall, because there was finally nothing left worth counting down to. Teach himself, meanwhile, sails on to Bath, North Carolina, then serving as the colony's capital, such as it was, with a considerably smaller, considerably richer crew, and does something that, on its face, looks almost like retirement. He presents himself to Governor Charles Eden and requests and receives a royal pardon under the same general amnesty that had already persuaded men like his old captain Benjamin Hornigold to quit the trade. Around this same time, according to accounts that carry a fair amount of local legend mixed in with whatever documented fact underlies them, Teach marries a young local woman. This appears to be the one genuinely documented marriage behind the wildly inflated 13 wives legend we touched on earlier tonight, though even the details of this particular union are not fully settled by the surviving record. For a brief stretch of the summer of 1718, Edward Teach lives something resembling an ordinary colonial life, a pardoned man, a new wife, a comfortable house in Bath, the adventure riding at anchor nearby. It does not last. Whatever peace he found in Bath was always going to be temporary for a man who had built his entire identity out of fear and plunder. And by the autumn, rumours were already circulating that the pardon had done considerably less to change his actual behaviour than the paperwork suggested. Dusk is settling over Ocracoke Inlet on the 21st of November 1718, when two small sloops, running without the usual identifying colours, ease into the shallow water near where a single vessel rides at anchor. Aboard that anchored vessel, a man who has spent the better part of 2 years building the most feared reputation on the American seaboard, is entertaining guests over drinks, apparently unconcerned by the approaching ships, because word hasn't yet reached him that they're anything other than merchant traffic. By the time he understands otherwise, it will be far too late to matter. This is the final chapter of Edward Teach's life, and it ends as so much of his career did, with a carefully staged piece of theatre, except this time the theatre belongs to the men hunting him, not to him. The month since Bath had not in fact produced the quiet retirement the pardon was supposed to guarantee. Rumours reached Virginia's governor, Alexander Spotswood, through the autumn of 1718 that Teach was continuing to operate, quietly trading in plundered goods and possibly taking new prizes, all while sheltering under the protection, tacit or, by some surviving correspondents considerably more than tacit, of North Carolina's own governor, Charles Eden, and Eden's secretary, a man named Tobias Knight, who was later investigated and formally accused of profiting from his association with the supposedly reformed pirate. Spotswood had no legal authority to act against Teach directly, since North Carolina lay outside Virginia's jurisdiction entirely, a technicality that infuriated him considerably less than it might have infuriated a more cautious administrator. Rather than wait for official sanction that seemed unlikely to arrive in time, Spotswood arranged, using his own funds and authority as governor, to hire 2 sloops and crew them with sailors drawn from Royal Navy warships stationed in Virginia waters, the Pearl and the Lime, placing the entire expedition under the command of a lieutenant named Robert Maynard, a career naval officer with considerably more combat experience at sea than Teach's own inexperienced hostage-turned-partner, Steeder Bonnet, had ever managed to accumulate. Maynard's 2 sloops, carrying somewhere in the range of 50-odd men between them, approached Ocracoke Inlet in the fading light of the 21st, and immediately ran into the same problem that had plagued Teach's own flotilla at Topsail Inlet 5 months earlier. Unfamiliar, shifting shallow water that neither of Maynard's vessel's pilots knew intimately. Both sloops ran aground during the approach, a delay that cost the expedition the element of full surprise, and gave Teach's smaller crew, reduced by this point to somewhere around 20 men aboard the Adventure, a fraction of the several hundred he'd once commanded, time to prepare for a fight neither side could yet be certain was actually coming. By the morning of the 22nd, with the tide risen enough to free his sloops, Maynard pressed the approach, and Teach, recognizing by then exactly what kind of vessels were closing on him, reportedly called out an offer of quarter for Maynard's men if they'd simply turn back, an offer Maynard just as reportedly refused outright. What followed was not the tidy naval engagement either side might have planned for. Teach's crew fired first, a cannon blast loaded with scrap metal and nails that tore through Maynard's lead sloop and killed or wounded a significant portion of the men visible on her deck, enough carnage that Teach, watching from his own ship, apparently believed he'd effectively won the engagement before it had properly begun. What he couldn't see was that Maynard had ordered the bulk of his surviving crew below deck specifically to create that illusion, keeping only a skeleton presence visible above while the rest waited, armed and ready for exactly the moment Teach's men would be tempted to board. Congratulations, in other words. The Master of Manufactured Appearances had just been out-theatred by a Royal Navy lieutenant using the oldest trick in the book, and it worked precisely because Teach's own reputation for near invincibility made the bluff more believable than it might have been against a more sceptical opponent. Teach led the boarding himself, and the fighting that followed, hand-to-hand across a cramped and blood-slicked deck, was as brutal as close combat between armed men typically was in this period. No theatre left in it at all, just cutlasses, pistols fired at point-blank range, and men grappling in confined space with no room to retreat. Maynard and Teach reportedly exchanged pistol fire directly, with Teach wounded but still fighting, before closing to cutlasses. The specific tally most often repeated that Teach ultimately absorbed something like 5 gunshot wounds, and more than 20 separate sword or cutlass wounds, before finally going down, comes down to us primarily through Johnson's account once again, and deserves exactly the same legendary caveat we've applied to every other Johnson-derived detail tonight, since no independent medical examination survives to confirm those precise numbers. What is far better documented, resting on Maynard's own official report filed afterward, is that Teach died in that fight, on his own deck, having refused every opportunity to surrender. What happened to his body immediately afterward is where the legend takes over almost entirely from the record, and it's worth naming that shift plainly, rather than letting it slide by unmarked. The most persistent version of the story, repeated in countless retellings since, claims that Teach's headless body, thrown overboard after Maynard's men decapitated him on deck, swam several full circles around the sloop before finally sinking, a detail so obviously mythic, so clearly built to serve the legend of a man too fearsome to die like an ordinary person, that no serious historian treats it as anything but folklore, and it's included here only so you know exactly where the line between documented fact and campfire embellishment actually sits. What is documented, again through Maynard's own report and subsequent colonial correspondence, is considerably more mundane, and in its own way more chilling. Teacher's head was cut from his body, suspended from the bowsprit of Maynard's sloop as proof of the kill, and as a warning to any remaining associates, and carried back to Virginia, where it was eventually displayed on a pole near the mouth of the Hampton River. A grim, deliberately public piece of state theatre, not so different in its underlying logic from the smoke and braided beard Teach himself had once used to project fear onto strangers. The performance, in the end, simply changed hands. Roughly a dozen of Teach's surviving crew were captured in the same engagement and transported to Virginia for trial, where the majority were convicted and hanged in the weeks that followed, though not all of them. A small number successfully argued they'd been forced men rather than willing pirates, and were acquitted, a rare instance of the legal system of the period actually drawing the same distinction between coercion and consent that mattered so much to men like Josiah Cobb throughout this story. Governor Eden and his secretary Tobias Knight, the North Carolina officials whose cooperation with Teach had drawn Spotswood's suspicion in the first place, faced their own investigation in the aftermath, though the political fallout for men of their social standing proved, unsurprisingly, considerably gentler than the fate that met the ordinary pirates captured alongside their patron. Knight died within months of the investigation beginning, his reputation never fully cleared. Eden remained governor until his own death roughly 2 years later, the accusations against him never definitively resolved one way or the other. Recovered artifacts from the site, once conserved, have gone on to a considerably more peaceful second life than anything aboard the original ship could have predicted. Many now sit in a dedicated conservation laboratory and museum in Beaufort, North Carolina, where members of the public can walk past a cannon, Teach's own gunners once loaded and fired, close enough to touch the glass separating them from it. It's an odd kind of closure, if closure is even the right word for it. A ship that spent its working life spreading fear through smoke and 40 guns now spends its afterlife teaching schoolchildren about tidal erosion, conservation chemistry, and the patient, unglamorous work of underwater archaeology. Teach built his entire career on making sure people looked at him and felt terror. 300 years later, people still look, but what they mostly feel now is curiosity, and perhaps a little of the same morbid fascination that's carried you through this whole story tonight. The specific, hard-to-name pull of a grim detail from long ago that you didn't quite expect to want to know, and found yourself wanting to know anyway. Israel Hands, the ship's master you met on that first quiet night aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge, was not present at Ocracoke when Teach finally died. By most reconstructions of his movements, he had been left behind in North Carolina, possibly still recovering from the knee wound Teach allegedly inflicted on him under the table, possibly simply not among the roughly 20 men. Teach selected to keep aboard the Adventure after the betrayal at Topsail Inlet. Hands was eventually captured and brought to trial himself, and here the record offers a rare, almost gentle ending, among a story otherwise thick with hangings. He testified against his former associates, cooperated with the authorities prosecuting Teach's surviving network, and received a pardon for his trouble. Popular legend, Johnson's, once again, and worth the same caution as everything else traced back to that source, claims Hands eventually made his way to London and spent his final years reduced to begging in the streets, a once feared pirate officer ending his life in quiet poverty, rather than on a gallows or a battlefield. Whether that specific detail is true or simply the kind of ironic moral bookend a storyteller like Johnson couldn't resist inventing, the broader shape of it fits what the more reliable record does show. Hands survived, when a great many of his former shipmates did not, by choosing cooperation over loyalty at exactly the moment loyalty had stopped paying dividends. Maynard himself, for all the fame the encounter eventually brought him in retrospect, received a considerably less glamorous reward at the time than 3 centuries of retellings might suggest. His official report to Spotswood, businesslike and largely free of the theatrical flourish later writers would layer onto the same events, focused mostly on losses sustained, prisoners taken, and the practical matter of disposing of recovered plunder. Plunder that, in a final small irony, became tangled up in a lengthy and somewhat undignified legal dispute over how the proceeds should be divided between the Crown, Spotswood personally, and the sailors who'd actually fought the engagement. Maynard petitioned for years afterward for what he considered fair compensation and recognition for the mission, without ever receiving quite what he felt he was owed, and his naval career, while respectable, never again reached the level of historical attention that a single morning off Ocracoke Inlet had briefly given it. It's a strangely fitting coda to the whole story. The man who finally killed the most theatrical pirate of the age went on to spend years fighting a tedious paperwork battle over money, while the legend of the man he'd killed only grew larger with every passing decade, entirely indifferent to how unglamorous its actual ending had been. For close to 280 years after that November morning at Ocracoke, the Queen Anne's Revenge herself remained exactly where Teach had left her, grounded and gradually buried beneath shifting sand near Beaufort Inlet, her story preserved only in second-hand accounts, court depositions, and the steadily thickening layer of legend Johnson's book had wrapped around the entire episode. That changed in November of 1996, when a private research firm working in partnership with North Carolina's state government located a wreck site near the inlet consistent with contemporary accounts of where the flagship had run aground, cannon visible on the seafloor, ballast stone, and, over the following years of careful, painstaking underwater archaeology, thousands of individual artefacts recovered and catalogued one at a time from the sediment that had protected them for nearly 3 centuries. More than 20 cannon have been recovered from the site to date, along with navigational instruments, sword hilts, and a genuinely striking assortment of smaller, more personal objects, a brass apothecary weight among them, a fragment of a medical syringe, small physical echoes of exactly the kind of medical supplies an entire flotilla depended on, and exactly the kind of chest an entire city was once forced to hand over to keep its own citizens alive. The identification of the wreck as the Queen Anne's Revenge, specifically, rather than some other vessel lost in the same treacherous inlet, rests on a careful accumulation of circumstantial evidence rather than any single definitive marker. The recovered cannon size and number consistent with contemporary accounts of the ship's armament, the wreck's location matching historical descriptions of where the grounding occurred, and artefacts whose dates of manufacture align with a vessel that would have been outfitted in the mid-1710s. North Carolina's state archaeologists and a rotating team of researchers have continued excavating the site for decades now, and the work is, by design, slow. Each timber, each cannon, each small brass fitting recovered under carefully controlled conditions to prevent the rapid deterioration that can destroy centuries-old wood and metal within hours of exposure to open air. It is, in its own quiet, unglamorous way, the least theatrical possible ending for a ship whose entire operational life had depended so heavily on theatre. Patient, methodical, scientific attention, replacing fear with careful documentation, 300 years after the fact. This is the story, in the end, of a reputation that outlived the man who built it by a considerable margin, a former privateer from an uncertain hometown who understood, better than almost any of his contemporaries, that the fastest way to win a fight was to make sure it never had to happen, and who paid for that strategy's eventual failure with his own head on a pole at the mouth of a Virginia river. Everything else, the 13 wives, the pistol shot under the table, the corpse swimming laps around Maynard's sloop, belongs to Charles Johnson, and to 3 centuries of storytellers who found the documented version of Edward Teach's life somehow not quite dramatic enough on its own, even though the documented version, medicine chest and marooned crew and gentleman pirate and all, was considerably stranger than most fiction manages to be. Picture that cabin one more time, the charts weighted down with a brass compass, the half-empty bottle of Madeira, a man working out, in the quiet hours before dawn, exactly how much fear an entire city was going to need to absorb before morning. Edward Teach got his medicine chest. He got his reputation too, the one that outlived him by 3 centuries and counting, though it cost him considerably more than it ever paid him back. Josiah Cobb got off that sandbar near Topsail Inlet and found his way, eventually, to a trade he chose for himself, rather than one forced onto him at the point of a cutlass. Samuel Wragg got his young relative home safely, and spent a frightened week in a pirate ship's hold finding room somehow to look after a stranger dying of fever beside him. None of it undoes the fear, or the coercion, or the men who never made it back to any port at all. But it's worth remembering, alongside all of that a brass apothecary weight and a fragment of a medical syringe sat quietly under Carolina Sand for nearly 280 years, waiting for someone patient enough to come looking. Small physical proof that even the most theatrical, most manufactured terror in early American history was, underneath all the smoke and the braided beard, still just people. Frightened, resourceful, occasionally kind, mostly trying to get through one more night the same way you're trying to get through this one. You're warm right now, in whatever bed or chair or quiet dark corner you're listening from. You're not counting chalk marks toward a share you'll never see. Nobody's demanding a ransom for your safe return, and there's no sandbar waiting for you at first light. That's not nothing. After a night like the one we just spent together, 300 years and one harbour blockade away, that's actually quite a lot. You're warm, you're safe. Tonight that's enough.